There are places that don't appear on maps. Forgotten corners of the world where time seems to have stopped, where no one remembers the names engraved on the tombstones, and the silence is so heavy it seems almost alive. Let me tell you about one of those places. I found it by accident, or maybe it was the place that found me. I'll never know for sure. It was a day like any other, or so I thought. I ventured out for a walk on the outskirts of a small town, one of those places that seem to be stuck in time. The sun was lazily setting, and a gentle breeze stirred the dry leaves around me. At some point, I lost track of time, as if nature itself had wrapped me in its silent embrace. And then I saw it. A stone arch, covered in moss and vines, stood before me. The words carved into what must have once been a grand inscription were barely discernible. Something inside me told me not to enter, that this place was not meant for the living, but I couldn't resist the temptation. Who could resist the call of the unknown? I took a step. Then another. And what I found was a cemetery, but not just any cemetery. The graves were in ruins, the crosses fallen, the tombstones covered by a layer of neglect only time can create. I wondered, who were buried here? Why did no one remember them? What had happened for this place to be completely forgotten? The air was heavy. It felt as if it was laden with stories that wanted to be told but refused to come out. Each stone, each leaf crunching under my feet, seemed to whisper secrets, ancient and dark. And despite the daylight, an intangible shadow covered the place. One of the graves caught my attention. Unlike the others, it was not in ruins. It was intact, as if someone had cared for it in secret, but there were no signs of recent visits. I approached slowly, and it was then that I felt a presence. I can't describe it exactly. It wasn't a person, but it wasn't exactly something either. It was a feeling. Have you ever felt like you're being watched, even when you're completely alone? The mystery of this forgotten cemetery had begun, and I couldn't tear my eyes away. I walked a bit further through the cemetery, each step causing the dry leaves beneath my feet to crackle, echoing in the silence as if I were interrupting something. The wind blew softly, but with a chill that didn't match the warm afternoon sun. Everything in that place seemed out of place, as if it were disconnected from reality, as if I had crossed an invisible boundary between what we know and something much older. I continued examining the gravestones, trying to read the names. But time had done its work, the letters were worn, almost erased. The dates were barely discernible, and the few I could make out were from the 19th century. I wondered who these people had been, what lives they had lived, and why no one came to honor their memory. There was a palpable loneliness, as if these souls had been forgotten not just by the world, but by time itself. Then, a different gravestone caught my attention. It wasn't just that it was in better condition than the others, but the inscription seemed more recent. Eleanor Blackwood, 1897 to 1935. I approached, surprised by how clear the writing was. The stone didn't seem to have suffered the ravages of time as much as the others. But what really drew my attention was a small metal figure, rusted but still recognizable, hanging from the cross. An amulet. A small locket with a broken chain. I held it between my fingers, feeling the cold metal against my skin. At that moment, something changed in the air. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but I felt it. The calm of the cemetery was broken. The wind stopped, and the silence became absolute. Suddenly, I felt watched, as if someone, or something, was observing me from the shadows. Instinctively, I dropped the locket and took a step back. What was in this place? I wondered. And more importantly, why did no one visit it? Everything seemed to suggest that this cemetery, once active, had fallen into oblivion, for some reason. I stood in front of Eleanor's grave, trying to piece together the story in my mind. The cemetery was abandoned, but this gravestone, this small sign of recent care, was a contradiction. I decided to investigate further. I approached the cemetery's entrance, where the old stone arch stood. I searched for any clues nearby, any sign of who might have been the last to visit this place. The gravel path leading to the cemetery was barely visible, overgrown with tall grass and weeds, as if no one had used it in decades. But then, just at the edge of the path, I saw something strange: footprints. They weren't recent, but they weren't old either. It seemed someone had passed through there, though I couldn't determine when. I turned my gaze back to the cemetery. That place had seen better days, and yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that there were more stories hidden beneath the surface. I decided to return to the village to ask the locals about the place, convinced that someone must know something. I arrived at the village at dusk. The few inhabitants I found seemed surprised to see me. It wasn't common for outsiders to venture into that forgotten corner. I headed to the tavern, a small, dark place where the creaking of the wood beneath my feet competed with the low murmur of conversations. "Excuse me," I said as I approached the bar. I found a cemetery just outside the village, and I was wondering if anyone could tell me something about it. Silence fell like a heavy weight. The few present stopped talking, and their gazes fixed on me. The bartender, a middle-aged man with a face marked by time and hard work, leaned forward. "You shouldn't have gone near that place," he said in a grave tone, as if each word weighed a ton. "That cemetery has been closed for a long time. No one goes there. No one should go." My curiosity was piqued even more. I knew there was something in that response, something they weren't telling me. I sat at one of the nearby tables, waiting for someone willing to talk. Finally, an older woman, with a wrinkled face and trembling hands, approached. Her voice was soft but laden with years of experience. "That cemetery was once the resting place of our families. But something changed, something that should never have been disturbed." "What happened?" I asked, eager to know more. The woman looked around to ensure no one else was listening, then whispered, "They say there was a tragedy. A young woman, Eleanor, died violently. After her death, things were never the same. People began to avoid the place. It was said that if you visited her grave, you could hear whispers in the breeze, as if she had never found peace." My mind began to piece together the clues. Eleanor Blackwood, her name on the gravestone, wasn't just another name. Something dark surrounded her death, and that something still seemed to cling to the cemetery. The next day, I decided to return to the place. This time, I had a clearer purpose. I wasn't just exploring, I was searching for answers. The cemetery was exactly as I had left it, silent and desolate. I headed straight to Eleanor's grave, determined to understand what had happened. I knelt before the gravestone, examining the broken locket once more. The old woman's words echoed in my mind, whispers in the breeze. I remained silent, listening intently. For a moment, I heard nothing but the wind rustling through the tree branches. But then, I heard it. It was faint, barely perceptible, like a distant murmur. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. It was sad, melancholic, like the echo of a voice that had been forgotten. My heart pounded as I tried to stay calm. I knew what I was hearing wasn't natural, but I didn't feel fear, only a profound sadness. Suddenly, I remembered something the old woman had mentioned. Eleanor hadn't died of natural causes, her life was taken, and her spirit had never found peace. How true was that? I decided to investigate more about her life and death. I went to the village's small library, a dusty building filled with old books and local documents. After hours of searching, I found what I was looking for, an old record about Eleanor's death. According to the documents, Eleanor Blackwood had been murdered in 1935. Her death was violent, and the culprit was never found. The village was shocked, and the Blackwood family, one of the wealthiest and most powerful in the area, left shortly afterward. Since then, the cemetery had been avoided. No one wanted to go near the place where Eleanor rested. The pieces began to fit together. Eleanor had not only been forgotten by the village, but also by history. Her murder remained unsolved, and her spirit seemed trapped, unable to rest. That's when I realized that my visit to the cemetery hadn't been a coincidence. I felt that somehow, Eleanor had called me. Perhaps, after all this time, someone was finally listening to her story. That night, I returned to the cemetery one last time. The wind blew softly, and the moon cast a ghostly light on the gravestones. I approached Eleanor's grave and placed the locket, which I still carried with me, on the gravestone. "Eleanor," I said softly, feeling an inexplicable connection with this woman I had never known. "I've heard your story. You're no longer alone." And then, the wind seemed to calm, and the whisper I had heard before vanished. I left the cemetery with a sense of relief, as if something had been released. Eleanor had finally been remembered. As I walked away, I couldn't help but think about the mysteries still buried beneath the soil of that forgotten cemetery. Maybe there were other whispers waiting to be heard, other stories waiting to be told. But for now, the silence of the cemetery no longer weighed so heavily on me. I had done my part, and with that, the mystery of the forgotten cemetery, at least for me, had come to an end. Walking along the path away from the cemetery, I couldn't stop thinking about everything I had experienced over those few days. Was it a coincidence? Or was there something deeper, something that had drawn me to that forgotten place? Perhaps I will never know. But one thing is certain, stories do not disappear simply because we forget them. They are there, waiting, hidden in the darkest corners, until someone is willing to listen. I stopped for a moment and looked back. The stone arch of the cemetery seemed further away, but I felt a strange peace as I gazed at it. I had heard Eleanor's story, felt her pain, and now, somehow, I felt that she could finally rest. You might wonder if all of this was real. Maybe it was just my imagination, or perhaps, that cemetery holds more secrets than I could tell in a single story. But I'll leave you with this question: what other stories are waiting, forgotten, in some corner of the world? Let me know in the comments what you think, and if you've ever felt that a place was calling to you, as if it wanted to tell you a secret that no one else could hear.